All right, let's go to this conversation now. Violence is once again at the center of some of the protests that news cameras have captured in various protests in recent days. In Tembisa, 4 people died during the shutdown over some electricity concerns. Now, at the same time, residents in Kagiso, as you've seen, in fact, shutting down the township, with claims even that some have been beaten and others were being surrounded, as police have said this evening. But why the violence? Does it signal that something deeper is going on? Let's speak to Annah Moyo-Kupeta, who's the Executive Director for the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Anna, thank you so much for your time this evening. How much of what we are seeing on the ground is as a result of a trust deficit between communities and those in charge?
Thank you. This has a lot to do with the breakdown of trust and confidence in the justice system, be it criminal justice system or just the justice system as a whole. When we begin to see community members taking the law into their own hands, when we begin to see community members taking to the streets, protesting against particular action or service delivery like what we saw in Tembisa, this is usually because of the frustration of lack of response from the leaders, the local leadership, the government, for instance, to some of the grievances that community members would have raised using more peaceful means. And when there is this breakdown, this is when we begin to see the high levels of frustration coming out during the protests. Protests around specific issues that are legitimate then becomes violence because of the rising anger, frustration, on lack of response. And this is becoming particularly a norm in South Africa. We are seeing most of the violence in the protests, in service delivery protests. We are seeing elements of criminality joining some of these protests and causing mayhem. But we are seeing sometimes unruly behavior. And all of this is a convolution of a number of issues. The frustrations I spoke about, the fact that there is no response usually from government when community members try more peaceful ways of raising or airing their grievances. But also what this indicates again is just the fact that violence is sort of becoming a language that community members use in order to attract the attention of leadership. Without violence, usually leaders do not come. In one of the studies that the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation has done as far back as 2011, the smoke that calls research that we did in about 8 communities, some of what community members said was that the burning of tires, the vandalism of property, and just the violence is the smoke that calls leaders to the side of the grievances of community members. So when this is becoming a norm, it is really worrying because already there would be signs before the violence, before the violent protests, for leaders to take action. What we saw in Tembisa, for instance, when leaders tried to mitigate this and there was no agreement or there was no solution between community members and leaders, was actually a precursor for us to say this was going to turn violence. And intelligence ought to have been on the ground to make sure that this does not escalate. So leadership at a provincial level, leadership at all sectors of society ought to have come to the community, to address the community in order to mitigate the violence that we saw in Tembisa in the past few days.
So Anna, listening to what you're saying then, it could also really be an indication as to why we are seeing more of an emboldened approach when we are watching these protests and the communities really looking like they don't fear anything and they're prepared for the worst.
Indeed, and this should be concerning to us because, again, it speaks to the normalization of violence. It speaks to even some impunity of some sort associated with violence that we see in society. And when we really look at who in society commit some of these crimes during protests, some of them are your law-abiding citizens in communities who, out of frustration, out of also of the mob mentality, the emboldenment that comes from being together with others. Again, this then is what results from everyone coming together, airing their grievances. We have pointed out as the center previously that the psychology of violence is that when you are in a mob, when you are in the collectives, usually it's the collective culture, the collective reasoning that takes over as opposed to individual reasoning around right and wrong. So the mob mentality then emboldens everyone to commit crime because, again, the being together, being collectives, usually apportioning blame to one or two individuals is not always easy.
Now,
so that emboldenment comes from being together in a mob setting.
And how much,
it's not easy to point out to someone having committed a crime.
How much of that as well, that emboldenment that we're talking about and the anger and the violence that we also see may come from what some have perceived as the heavy-handedness of the police when they respond, particularly to some of these protests?
Some of it really is the violence that happens even before the response by the police. But again, highlighting or showcasing the lack of trust, the lack of confidence in the criminal justice system, in the government system as a whole. Usually the heavy-handedness of the police is failure to deal with protests, deal with crowds gathering together and just mitigating that and dealing with that. So when police start to use live ammunition against protesters who are unarmed in most times, this becomes concerning and becomes a separate issue altogether, where we are looking at the lack of training for the police to address crowds, to deal with crowds, an issue that has been raised numerous times by civil society actors, us included as the center. But again, another issue that also adds to the anger that communities then exhibit in the aftermath of such violence. We've seen it in Marikana. We have seen it, for instance, in a number of communities previously. We have seen a number of people being killed by police action due to this failure to really deal with the crowds effectively or in non-violent ways. Crowd control is something that the police are yet to really get right. And this further makes or turns community members violent when now they're responding to some of the violence that has happened. And Tembisa is a case in point where we saw the violence before police action and we saw the violence even after the police action out of anger of the police using live ammunition and sometimes using live ammunition on people who are in their yards, people who are not actually part of the protesters.
So are we sitting then on a ticking time bomb?
We are sitting on a ticking time bomb. We are sitting on a powder keg that can go off at any time. And when we see such outbursts of violence like what we've seen in Tembisa, it is a microcosm of a much larger problem that we need to address as a society. First and foremost, we need to address this question: why are we violent? What are the key drivers of this kind of violence that we're experiencing in our communities? Secondly, we need to get to the root causes. What are some of the structural issues and systems that facilitate or give rise to this violence that we see in our communities? What are some of the fuelers? And when we begin to unpack these issues, dealing with the root causes, dealing with the key drivers of this violence, dealing with the fuelers and triggers of this violence, through dialogues, through providing platforms where community members can air their grievances to leaders, when we begin to see visibility of leaders in communities wanting to engage with communities genuinely and getting the community buy-in and viewpoints on some of the issues like the increases that we see, the socioeconomic challenges that we are facing in the country, then we can begin to unpack the violence that we are seeing in society, and then we can make inroads in addressing some of this violence.
All right, thank you so much for your time. That was Annah Moyo-Kupeta, the Executive Director for the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Some real important questions to answer there. Why is that we're seeing quite a lot of violence in these protests, and also what are the triggers? And these, of course, are questions we'll continue to try and really get some answers to.